Well, hi everybody, I'm Harry. Over the past couple of years, I've been working at Aberystwyth University on Work Package 9 alongside David and Pip, where we've been investigating artificial habitats for commercially important species. Today, I'm going to take you through the background and some of the results of the work that we've been carrying out at an offshore wind farm site in North Wales, where we've been investigating the habitat use of lobsters in order to gain a better understanding of how these species are interacting with these sites. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, offshore wind farms are on the rise. As a result of climate change and global energy demands, we've seen the rapid expansion of offshore wind farms across the globe. Total installed capacity has increased from 1.4 to 35 gigawatts in the last decade. And with countries setting targets to move away from fossil fuel use and towards net zero targets, this expansion is only set to increase. And with it, we're going to see a massive increase in the amount of man-made structures in our offshore environment. Currently, the UK is a world leader in offshore wind energy production. We have a current installed capacity of just over 10 gigawatts, but this is going to dramatically increase. In the UK government's recent energy security strategy, they set out plans of reaching a total installed capacity of 40 gigawatts by 2030 and then 125 gigawatts by 2050. So here you can see what the UK coastline is going to look like in order to reach that 40 gigawatt target, with large developments planned down the east coast of the UK and also concentrated developments in the Irish Sea. So if this is what the UK coastline is going to look like in order to reach that 40 gigawatt target, you can only imagine the amount of development and the amount of man-made structures that are going to be introduced into our marine environment in order to reach that 2050 target. Development on this sort of scale is bound to have significant impacts on the marine environment, particularly in areas like the Irish Sea, where we're seeing this concentrated wind farm development and there are unknown cumulative impacts. The impacts from offshore wind farm development are not just restricted to marine flora and fauna, there are also expected to be impacts on other users of the marine environment. Quite often, we see industries like fishing excluded from certain areas during wind farm construction and even operation. And that's why we're at a really pivotal moment in trying to gain a better understanding of how these developments are going to impact marine species and also other users of the marine environment prior to all of these increased developments taking place. The impacts from offshore wind farm development can be placed into two categories. There are those that take place during the construction phase and those that take place during the operational phase. The impacts that our research focuses on are that take place as a result of habitat alteration. This happens when artificial hard substrates are introduced into the marine environment. So across the UK and Europe, we're seeing offshore wind farm development take place in shallow, sand-dominated habitats. When this development takes place, large amounts of artificial hard substrates are introduced into these environments in the form of turbines and also scour protection. Scour protection is a layer of rocks and boulders that's added around the base of each turbine in order to protect them from erosion. When these hard substrates are added, we see this process known as the reef-effect take place, in which species that are usually associated with areas of natural reef move into these sand-dominated habitats and colonize the wind farm-associated hard substrates. This has been shown to lead to large changes in biomass and biodiversity. Now, while we have a good understanding of the types of species that are moving into these areas as a result of this reef effect, how these species interact with these sites and the general ecology of these sites has received relatively little attention. But here you can see that reef effect taking place where the turbine has become colonized by fouling organisms like mussels. And then we also see this concentration of higher trophic level species around the base of the turbine associated with that scour defense layer. Now, because some of these higher trophic level species are quite often commercially important species like Atlantic cod, edible crab, and the European lobster, there's the idea that actually these wind turbines might present potential fishing opportunities. And that's why in this case, we chose to investigate the interactions of a commercially important species, the European lobster. To do this, we used an animal tracking technology called acoustic telemetry. Acoustic telemetry relies on two pieces of equipment. The first is an acoustic receiver. This is essentially a hydrophone. They get moored to the seabed in a strategic array around particular areas of interest. And then we have the acoustic transmitters. These are attached to your study animal. They give off a signal up to every 9 seconds, And whenever they're within 250 meters of a receiver will log detections of these signals. When one signal is picked up by 3 or more receivers, we can triangulate the detection and work out the location of the animal at the time of that signal. We conducted our study at the Gwyntamore wind farm in North Wales. This wind farm was constructed between 2011 and 2015, consists of 160 turbines and covers an area of 80 square kilometres. We deployed 18 acoustic receivers in association with 3 turbine locations and their associated hard substrate. So those grey circles that you can see there are the areas of scour protection at each turbine location, and the black dots surrounding them are our receiver locations. So throughout the summer last year, we tagged and released 33 lobsters. All lobsters were caught, tagged, and then released at the same turbine locations. We then tracked their movements continuously from June all the way through until October, when we removed the equipment from the water. So once that equipment goes in the water, that's it. You just kind of have to sit back and hope that your tagged animals don't leave that total detectable area and you're left with no data at the end of the study. We were really pleased that when we pulled the equipment from the water, we'd collected just over 2 million detections from the lobsters, with an average of around 65,000 per individual. One of the first factors that we wanted to look at from this data was how resident these lobsters were to these tagging sites. To do this, we created a Residency index which related to the lobsters' presence on a daily basis. 70% of the lobsters were recorded every single day throughout their total days at liberty. Days at liberty is the total number of days from first to last detection for each individual. 32% of lobsters were recorded every single day throughout the entire study period. So that was 111 days of continuous tracking information. And 40% of lobsters were still present at their original tagging sites at the end of the study. So overall, we recorded really high residency for the majority of individuals included in this study, which suggests to us that previous records of lobsters within wind farms are not just transient individuals moving through the site, but actually lobsters found within these wind farms can not only be expected to be resident to the wind farm itself, but actually resident to individual areas of scour protection within that site. Now, throughout the study, we did also record instances of individuals leaving their tagging sites and either being detected at another one of our tagging sites, or they were caught by fishermen at other turbine locations throughout the site. This got us to start thinking about why an individual might leave these areas of scour protection, and actually that it's quite likely that these individual areas of scour have limited carrying capacities. To investigate this further, we looked at the number of lobsters we were recording on a daily basis. This number ranged from 2 to 10 with a mean of 6 across all the sites. So here you can see quite frequent fluctuations in this number, and we think this is likely to be due to a behaviour that lobsters are known to exhibit, which is known as demographic diffusion. This takes place when population densities reach a point that competition for resources is so intense that lobsters actually just leave the area that they're originally in search of new resources. So here we think these fluctuations are probably due to non-tagged lobsters moving into our tagging sites, increasing competition for resources, and our tagged lobsters move elsewhere. The next thing we wanted to look at from this data was where the lobsters were spending time throughout the study. To do that, we used that triangulation process I mentioned earlier to create a metric that's known as centres of activity. Centres of activity is essentially an average geographic position for each individual based over a given time period. So in this case, we worked out the lobster's average geographic position throughout every 60 minutes of the study. So those are those areas of scour protection again, and that's what they look like with the centre of activity points for 4 individuals laid over the top. You notice that a lot of these points are focused around the edge of the scour protection, and that's because when the lobsters move inside the crevices of the scour, the signals of the transmitters are actually blocked. So from these centre of activity points, we can begin to investigate the amount of space that the lobsters are using. To do that, we used a kernel density estimator to create a utilisation distribution. And from the utilisation distribution, we can estimate the lobster's home range and core territory. So home range size was around 15,000 metres squared, which represented roughly 50% of our total detectable area at each site. 100% of the lobsters' home ranges either fully or partially overlapped with the areas of scour protection, as did 70% of the lobster's core territories. So what we're also able to do from these centre of activity points is begin to simulate the lobster's movement over time. So here you can see one individual's movement throughout the entire study period. Now, apart from the fact that, well, I think anyway, these look quite cool, they do demonstrate really nicely these repeated movements towards and away from the areas of scour protection. So this, in combination with those high residency results we looked at earlier, suggests to us that these areas of scour protection can support lobsters for extended periods of time, and they don't have to move very far away from them in order to get all the resources they need to survive. We think it's really likely that lobsters are feeding on loose clumps of mussels that are falling off of the turbines. Across mussel farms across the US and Canada, we see really high populations of lobsters living beneath them, doing the exact same thing. So we think a similar process is taking place within these wind farms, where the lobsters are not only attracted to these turbine locations for the shelter that's provided by the scour protection, but also food availability that's in really close proximity to this shelter. So overall, this was the first time that acoustic telemetry has been applied to any species within an offshore wind farm in the UK. And we think that from the number of detections we recorded and the level of positioning accuracy that we recorded, that this is a suitable method for investigating species interaction with offshore wind farms and artificial structures into the future. And we think it's going to be really interesting to see this technology applied to different species. The results of our residency and space use investigation suggest that, yeah, these areas of scour protection can support multiple individuals for extended periods of time, but it's quite likely that these individual areas have limited carrying capacities, and if met, lobsters will move away from them in search of less pressured resources. Moving into the future, we think that it's going to be really important to gain an understanding of what these carrying capacities are, as this information is going to be really important in gaining a better understanding of what are the potential fishery benefits arising from offshore wind farms. And that's going to be increasingly important as we see this increased development throughout the UK and Europe, and the co-location of offshore wind farms and fisheries becomes increasingly important. Thank you very much for listening. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.